In a room veiled by the shadows of Elizabethan London, where candlelight dances with the ghosts of forgotten knowledge, sits a single, enigmatic object. It is a mirror, but not of glass. It is a perfect disk of polished obsidian, a pool of liquid night that seems to absorb all light, all sound, all certainty. For centuries, it has been a silent witness to a story deliberately erased from the annals of history. Tonight, we listen to the echo it holds, the voice of a man who gazed into its depth seeking enlightenment, but found himself on the precipice of damnation. A weary, trembling voice, recorded meticulously in a secret diary, whispers a chilling confession across time. The angels ordered the most terrible of pacts, an obedience that would cost my soul, and I question for the first time whom I truly serve. This voice belonged not to a fringe madman or a forgotten occultist. It was the voice of the most brilliant mind in England, the intellectual titan of his age. He was the whisper in the Queen's ear, the architect of a burgeoning empire, a Renaissance man in the truest sense. His name was John Dee, a mathematical genius who set the date for Queen Elizabeth I's coronation, a cartographer whose maps guided English ships to the New World, and a philosopher who believed the universe was a cipher written by God. He was a man of logic, reason, and empirical science. So why did he abandon the world of known facts for the perilous realm of the unseen? Why did a man who could command the respect of monarchs find himself taking orders from voices in a black mirror? The story that follows has been suppressed for 400 years, a footnote in the biography of a great man, dismissed as an embarrassing lapse into insanity. But the truth is far more complex and terrifying. This is not a simple tale of delusion or fraud. It is a journey into the heart of a dangerous obsession, a quest for absolute knowledge that threatened to unravel the very fabric of reality. It forces us to confront an unsettling question. When we peel back the veil of the world we know, do we converse with angels, or do we merely give a new name to the ancient darkness that stares back? The secrets hidden in John Dee's diaries suggest an answer we may not be prepared to hear. To understand the magnitude of John Dee's fall, one must first grasp the height of his influence. In the vibrant, volatile court of Queen Elizabeth I, he was a figure of immense authority, a quiet power whose intellect was a cornerstone of the burgeoning English state. When the young queen needed to secure her reign under the most favorable celestial alignments, it was Dee she summoned. He was her oracle. On January 15, 1559, Elizabeth was crowned on the date meticulously selected by Dee, a masterstroke of political theatre and astrological calculation designed to project an aura of divine right and unshakable destiny. This single act cemented his position as a trusted, confidential advisor. He was not merely a court magician performing for amusement. He was a strategic counselor, wielding knowledge as both a shield and a sword for his monarch in an age of conspiracy and uncertainty. His value extended far beyond the realm of ceremony and prophecy. Dee was the intellectual engine behind England's global ambitions. It was he who first articulated the vision of a British empire, providing the philosophical and cartographical justification for its expansion. While sailors and privateers braved the unknown oceans, they often did so with charts refined by Dee's hand, using navigational techniques he had perfected. He pored over ancient texts and the latest reports from explorers, synthesizing them into a strategic map for English dominance. He saw the world not as it was, but as it could be, an interconnected globe with England at its center. In the great chess match against the Spanish Empire, John Dee was Elizabeth's grandmaster, anticipating rival moves and plotting the course for England's ascent as a world power. Yet beyond the gilded halls of Whitehall and the bustling docks of London, Dee harbored a private and far more consuming ambition. At his home in Mortlake, he assembled the most extensive private library in all of England, a collection of over 4,000 books and manuscripts that dwarfed the collections of Oxford and Cambridge combined. This was no mere gentleman's library. It was the crucible for his life's true work. Within its walls, scientific treatises on optics and geometry stood beside arcane grimoires detailing angelic hierarchies and the secrets of alchemy. To Dee, these were not opposing fields of study. He saw them as two sides of the same divine coin, two different languages attempting to describe the singular, underlying truth of God's creation. His library was his sanctuary, a testament to his belief that all knowledge was sacred. This very pursuit, however, led him to a devastating intellectual crisis. After a lifetime spent mastering every available discipline, from mathematics to cryptography, Dee felt he had reached the absolute limit of human understanding. He had read every book, studied every chart, and decoded every puzzle accessible to man, only to find himself staring into a void. He described the natural sciences as a shallow pool, reflecting a distant light but offering no real depth. The knowledge he possessed felt incomplete, a fragmented echo of a far greater, purer wisdom. He grew obsessed with the idea of a universal truth, a form of primordial knowledge known to biblical patriarchs like Adam and Enoch, which had been lost to humanity. For a mind as vast and ambitious as Dee's, this limitation was an unbearable prison. Thus, the most respected scientist in England made a fateful and radical decision. If the world of men could not provide the answers he sought, he would turn his gaze to the world of spirits. He concluded that the only way to attain true wisdom was to bypass the flawed vessel of human intellect and communicate directly with its divine source, the angels of God. This was not in his mind a rejection of science, but its ultimate extension, an experiment of the highest order. He began a new secret diary, filling its pages not with calculations or maps, but with prayers, rituals, and a desperate plea for a guide who could help him unlock the heavens. John Dee, the Queen's philosopher, was about to become God's student, and he was dangerously unaware of who or what might answer his call. John Dee's grand theory was in place, his ritual tools were consecrated, and his ambition burned brighter than ever. Yet he faced a critical, humbling obstacle. He could not see. The visions remained locked within the dark heart of the obsidian mirror, and the voices of the angels were silent to his ears. He was the architect of a bridge to heaven, but was himself blind and deaf to the world he sought to reach. His diaries from this period are filled with notes of profound frustration as he auditioned a series of scryers, only to dismiss them as inept frauds or weak-willed fools. His divine science was stalled at its very inception, a celestial orchestra waiting for a conductor who could read the silent music. The grandest experiment of the age was failing for want of a window gazer, leaving Dee in a state of intellectual and spiritual torment. Then in March of 1582, a man who was all window and storm arrived unannounced at his door. His name was Edward Kelly. He was a stark and unsettling contrast to the aging, scholarly Dee, younger, with a volatile intensity burning in his eyes, and shrouded in a dubious past. Rumors clung to him like a beggar's rags, tales of alchemy, necromancy, and a conviction for forgery, for which it was said the authorities had cropped his ears, a permanent mark of a counterfeiter. He was not the pious acolyte Dee might have wished for, but a man of the fringes, an opportunist whose charisma was matched only by his desperation. Kelly was a human shadow, and Dee, in his own desperation, was ready to invite him into the light of his sacred project. The first session was a test, conducted in the heavy, expectant silence of Dee's inner sanctum. The room was prepared, the holy seals laid out, the obsidian stone gleaming like a black sun. While Dee knelt and prayed with the fervor of a lifetime's longing, Kelly, the accused charlatan, simply stared into the void of the mirror. A tense silence stretched, and then it happened. Kelly's posture stiffened. His voice, now strangely flat and distant, began to describe a figure materializing within the stone, an angel, glorious and terrible. He relayed its message with a clarity and authority that stunned Dee to his core. In that moment, all of Dee's skepticism dissolved, replaced by a euphoric certainty. He had found his seer. The great work could finally begin. A strange and powerful symbiosis was born. Their ritual became an unvarying performance of codependency. Kelly, the conduit, would sit entranced, his gaze locked upon the stone or crystal, his body a mere vessel for the sights and sounds of another realm. Dee, the scholar, remained at a slight remove, a frantic scribe documenting every word, every symbol in his diary. He was the director and archivist of a reality he could not witness, entirely reliant on Kelly's testimony. Kelly, in turn, was utterly dependent on Dee for his livelihood, his safety from prosecution, and the intellectual framework that gave his visions meaning and legitimacy. They were two halves of a single obsessive being, bound together by a shared secret and a mutual need that would eventually consume them both. The communications quickly evolved beyond simple messages. The entities, speaking through Kelly, announced that the languages of man, including the Holy Latin, were corrupt and inadequate for their divine discourse. They began to reveal a new alphabet, a celestial tongue they called the angelic, or Enochian language. Kelly would describe the unique, elegant letters as they appeared to him and pronounce the strange, guttural words, which Dee transcribed with feverish precision. To Dee, this was the ultimate proof of authenticity. A common trickster might fake a vision, but to invent an entire, grammatically coherent language, complete with its own unique syntax, was surely beyond the scope of human fraud. The Enochian keys, as they became known, were for Dee the irrefutable voice of God. Initially, the angelic dialogues were a fountain of enlightenment, confirming all of Dee's most profound hopes. The beings who identified themselves as holy messengers, such as the archangel Uriel, delivered breathtaking discourses on the nature of creation, the divine architecture of the cosmos, and the lost secrets of the Book of Genesis. They provided Dee with complex diagrams of the celestial hierarchy and promised to help him compile a book of pure knowledge that would heal the schisms of the Reformation and usher in a new age of human wisdom. For a brief, ecstatic period, John Dee believed he was not just a scholar, but a new prophet, chosen by God to receive a fresh revelation and restore the world. However, the celestial agenda soon took a subtle and worldly turn. The divine philosophy began to be interspersed with more practical and far more tempting revelations. The angels started to dictate complex alchemical recipes, detailing the precise processes for creating the legendary philosopher's stone and transmuting base metals into pure gold. This immediately appealed to Edward Kelly's more venal ambitions, shifting the focus of the sessions from pure wisdom to the promise of unimaginable wealth. Dee, a man of intellect but also of mounting debts, found himself caught in the allure. The sacred quest for knowledge was now becoming entangled with the very worldly desire for riches, blurring the line between divine revelation and treasure hunt. The communications then expanded into an even more dangerous arena, European politics. The angelic voices began to function as a kind of celestial intelligence agency. They issued stark warnings about the growing threat of the Spanish Armada, revealed supposed plots within the French court, and offered strategic advice intended for Queen Elizabeth's ears. For Dee, this was a powerful synthesis of his two great passions, his occult work and his service to the English crown. He was no longer just a philosopher, he was a divinely sanctioned spy master, an instrument of God's will in the great game of nations. This fusion of the sacred and the political drew him deeper into the web, making him believe his work was not only spiritually significant, but patriotically essential. As their mission grew in perceived importance, so did an insidious paranoia, carefully nurtured by the angelic voices. The spirits began to warn Dee of enemies and spies within Elizabeth's own court, painting his longtime rival, William Cecil, as a demonic agent sent to obstruct the divine plan. They fostered a siege mentality, convincing Dee that he and Kelly were isolated soldiers of light in a world teeming with darkness. The scrying room, once a chamber of enlightenment, transformed into an echo chamber of suspicion and fear. The angels demanded absolute, unquestioning loyalty, systematically cutting Dee off from his network of peers and positioning themselves as his only trustworthy allies, thus tightening their psychological grip over the increasingly isolated scholar. Edward Kelly's role in this dynamic became ever more central and dramatic. As the sole channel for these powerful messages, his personal influence soared. He would often feign exhaustion or spiritual torment after the sessions, collapsing as if drained by the immense power flowing through him. Whether this was a genuine ordeal or a masterful piece of theater, its effect was to place Dee in a position of perpetual gratitude and debt. Kelly began to argue with the angels on Dee's behalf, creating dramatic scenes where he would seem to resist their harsher commands, only to relent out of a pained sense of duty. This performance only solidified his credibility in Dee's eyes, while paradoxically giving him ultimate control over the content of the revelations. The angelic tests of faith grew stranger and more disturbing. They were no longer mere intellectual exercises, but demands of blind, painful obedience. In one instance, they commanded Dee to throw a precious ancient manuscript into the fire, a sacrifice of the very worldly knowledge he had once cherished, to prove his devotion to their divine wisdom. They dictated periods of extreme fasting and prayer that left both men weak and psychologically vulnerable. Each bizarre command that Dee followed, each piece of his old life that he surrendered, was a step further down a path of no return. His critical faculties were being systematically dismantled, replaced by a reflexive obedience to the voices from the stone and their increasingly erratic seer. The spiritual invasion did not stop at the study door. It bled into the most intimate corners of their lives. The angels began to issue pronouncements on domestic matters, commenting on the characters and actions of Dee's wife, Jane, and Kelly's wife, Joan. Jane Dee, a practical and grounded woman, harbored a deep and growing distrust of Edward Kelly, seeing him as a malevolent influence over her husband. This friction is palpable in Dee's diaries, where he records his anguish over the conflict between his celestial mission and his terrestrial duties as a husband and father. The angels, however, framed Jane's resistance as a spiritual weakness, a worldly attachment hindering God's plan, further isolating Dee within his own home. Finally, the angels delivered their most audacious command yet. Dee and Kelly were to abandon their lives in England entirely. Their new mission was to embark on a grand tour of the courts of Europe, beginning with the enigmatic Holy Roman Emperor, Rudolf II in his castle at Prague. They were to be divine ambassadors, carrying the angelic knowledge that would unite a fractured Christendom and prepare the world for a new age. To Dee, this was the ultimate validation of his life's work, a chance to reshape history. To Kelly, it was a path to fame and fortune on an international scale. In 1583, they obeyed, packing their families, their alchemical equipment, and the sacred artifacts, and set sail for the continent, leaving the relative safety of England behind forever. As their ship cut across the channel, a profound and terrifying question hung in the air, unspoken but omnipresent. Who exactly were these angels? Were they messengers from God, testing their servants with inscrutable trials for a greater purpose? Was Edward Kelly a master manipulator, a puppeteer of genius-level cunning, spinning an elaborate fantasy to control the elder scholar? Or had Dee, in his arrogant pursuit of forbidden knowledge, succeeded all too well? Had he opened a door not to heaven, but to somewhere else, a place where intelligent, ancient, and utterly non-human entities had been waiting, ready to offer a poisoned chalice of wisdom in exchange for the souls of men who dared to knock? Their arrival on the continent was charged with momentous expectation. Their destination was Prague, the glittering, esoteric heart of Europe, and home to the Holy Roman Emperor Rudolf II. The city itself was a labyrinth of alchemical workshops, Kabbalistic scholars, and mystical dreamers, a seemingly perfect ecosystem for Dee's revelations. Emperor Rudolf, a known melancholic and an obsessive patron of the occult arts, was the man Dee believed was destined to receive the angelic wisdom. He envisioned a grand intellectual and spiritual alliance, a meeting of minds that would validate his mission and place the divine knowledge at the center of world power. As he approached the towering spires of Prague Castle, John Dee felt he was on the threshold of fulfilling his life's ultimate purpose. The reality, however, was a bitter and humiliating disappointment. After much effort, Dee secured a single audience with the emperor, but the encounter was a disaster. Rudolf, surrounded by cautious advisors and the ever-watchful papal nuncio, was more fearful than enlightened. While intrigued by Dee's reputation, he was terrified of the accusations of necromancy that followed him. The papal authorities swiftly denounced Dee and Kelly as heretics trafficking with demonic forces. Instead of being embraced as a prophet, Dee was branded a sorcerer. The emperor offered no support, no patronage, and strongly suggested they leave his domain. The first great test of their divine mission had ended in failure, leaving them exposed and unwelcome in a foreign land. Shunned by the emperor, their grand embassy devolved into a nomadic existence. They became wanderers, drifting through the principalities of Germany and Poland, a strange caravan of two families bound by a sacred quest that no one else seemed to want. The search for a powerful patron became a desperate, itinerant struggle for survival. The promise of alchemical gold, once a secondary concern, was now their primary means of support as they performed demonstrations for curious but non-committal nobles and merchants. The divine mission to save Christendom was fraying at the edges, becoming a threadbare traveling show. The constant uncertainty and displacement took a heavy toll, particularly on their wives and children, who were unwilling passengers on this journey into the unknown. The persistent failure and financial strain began to poison the very heart of the enterprise. The relationship between Dee and Kelly, the delicate symbiosis they had in England, curdled into resentment and suspicion. Kelly, who had never shared Dee's lofty spiritual goals, grew increasingly bitter. He felt he was the one taking all the risks, his soul the battleground for these terrifying visions, while Dee reaped the intellectual rewards and maintained the air of a gentleman scholar. He began to challenge Dee's authority, question his interpretations, and complain ceaselessly of his own suffering. The cramped quarters and shared anxieties of their travels became a pressure cooker, amplifying their differences until the partnership was defined by a quiet, simmering warfare. The angelic entities, far from being a source of comfort, seemed to delight in fanning these flames of discord. During their sessions, the voices would expertly play the two men against each other, employing a cunning psychological strategy of division. One day they would praise Kelly's spiritual sensitivity while admonishing Dee for his intellectual pride. The next, they would chastise Kelly for his worldly greed and commend Dee for his unwavering piety. This masterful manipulation ensured the two men remained locked in a state of mutual distrust, unable to form a united front or question the source of the messages. Instead, they became even more reliant on the voices as the sole arbiters of their fractured reality, each man vying for the entity's favor against the other. Caught in the crossfire of this spiritual and psychological war was Dee's wife, Jane. Her entries in her husband's diary, often recorded by Dee himself, paint a portrait of profound suffering. She was a woman exiled, raising her children in a series of unfamiliar and often hostile environments, all in service of a mission she instinctively distrusted. Her open contempt for Kelly was a constant source of friction. She saw him not as a seer, but as a predator who had captured her husband's mind. Jane's grief, her fear for her children's safety, and her yearning for the simple life they had left behind in England served as a tragic, human counterpoint to Dee's celestial ambitions. She was the living embodiment of the immense collateral damage of his obsession. For a brief, hopeful period, their fortunes appeared to change when they found a willing patron in Count Adalbert Waski, a powerful Polish nobleman. Deeply fascinated by their claims, Waski funded their research and travels, even bringing them to his estates in Krakow. For the first time in years, Dee and Kelly were treated not as vagrants, but as respected scholars. The scrying sessions intensified, and it seemed their mission was finally back on course. However, the respite was short-lived. Waski, whose own finances were less stable than he had let on, eventually ran out of both money and patience. The familiar pattern of hope followed by crushing failure repeated itself, plunging them even deeper into desperation and mutual recrimination. Amidst this turmoil, Edward Kelly's behavior grew increasingly erratic and unstable. He was prone to bouts of heavy drinking, followed by fits of violent rage or deep melancholic depression. His most potent weapon against Dee was the recurring threat of abandonment. He would frequently claim that the angels, disgusted with their lack of progress or Dee's spiritual failings, had forbidden him to continue scrying. These announcements would send Dee into a blind panic, forcing him to plead and bargain to keep the channel open. It became a cruel, cyclical performance, making it impossible for Dee to discern Kelly's genuine spiritual torment from his calculated, manipulative power plays to gain more control. As their hopes of influencing monarchs faded, the practical pursuit of alchemy became their all-consuming focus. The dream of enlightening Europe was supplanted by the grubby, desperate need to create gold. The angelic messages themselves reflected this shift, evolving from grand cosmic philosophy into cryptic, technical recipes for alchemical processes. Their lodgings were transformed into makeshift laboratories, filled with the noxious fumes of mercury and sulfur, as they toiled endlessly over furnaces and alembics. The noble quest for the prima sapientia, the first wisdom of God, had degraded into a frantic, obsessive hunt for the philosopher's stone, not for enlightenment, but simply to pay their mounting debts and fund their continued exile. Even the character of the visions themselves began to rot. The benevolent and articulate angels like Uriel and Raphael appeared less frequently, replaced by a host of more chaotic, menacing, and demanding entities. They delivered terrifying, apocalyptic visions of a Europe engulfed in religious war and divine punishment, relentlessly insisting that only Dee and Kelly's obedience to their commands could avert catastrophe. The pressure was immense. The sessions, once a source of ecstasy for Dee, now often left Kelly pale and trembling, describing monstrous forms in the stone and discordant, shrieking sounds. The gateway they had opened seemed to be swinging wider, pulling them toward a source that felt less like heaven and more like the abyss. It was in this atmosphere of intense pressure and decay that the entities began to speak of a final, binding test. They hinted that a new and final covenant was necessary to seal their holy work and unlock the ultimate secrets they held back. The language they used was deliberately vague yet heavy with ominous significance, suggesting that all earthly laws and moral codes were secondary to the demands of divine will. They implied that the partnership between Dee and Kelly, though blessed, was still incomplete. A greater, more profound sacrifice was required to prove their worthiness, a sacrifice that would merge their fates in a way that could never be undone, creating a tone of impending, unavoidable dread. Their wanderings eventually led them to southern Bohemia and the patronage of Wilhelm of Roemberg, one of the wealthiest nobles in the kingdom. In his castle at Chebon, surrounded by forests and fish ponds, they found a secluded refuge. It was here, far from the prying eyes of London or Prague, that the final, terrible act of their spiritual drama would be staged. The isolation was both a comfort and a prison. The outside world, with its rules and consequences, faded into irrelevance. All that remained was the claustrophobic world they had created, a world that revolved entirely around the scrying table, the obsidian stone, and the insistent, disembodied voices that now governed their every waking moment. The breaking point came swiftly. At Chebon, Kelly announced that his spiritual torment was too great, and the angels had finally released him from his service. He declared the work was finished. In a fit of theatrical rage, he claimed to have smashed the scrying stone to pieces and began to pack his belongings. For Dee, this was the ultimate cataclysm. His entire life's work, the divine mission to which he had sacrificed his fortune, His reputation and his family's happiness was about to be obliterated. In his diary, he recorded his absolute despair, begging and pleading with Kelly, offering him anything if he would only stay. This moment stripped Dee of his final shred of dignity and control, leaving him utterly broken and vulnerable. After reducing Dee to a state of complete submission, Kelly, as if by miracle, relented. He announced that a new vision had appeared. The angelic spirit Madimi, who often manifested as a child, had come to him weeping and begged him not to break their holy fellowship. The angelic command was now absolute. Their partnership was divinely ordained and must be preserved at any cost. But its continuation was conditional. It required the immediate fulfillment of the new covenant, the final terrible test of obedience they had been hinting at for months. Kelly agreed to stay, but the power dynamic was now completely inverted. Dee was no longer the master of the project. He was a hostage, ready to accept any command to prevent the silence he now feared more than damnation. And so, the stage was meticulously set for the final revelation. The air in the castle at Shebon was thick with a palpable sense of dread and twisted anticipation. The two men, their fates irrevocably entangled by years of shared obsession, prepared for the scrying session that would change everything. Dee, exhausted and psychologically shattered, waited for the final, ultimate secret he believed would unlock the gates of heaven. He was a man standing on the edge of a cliff, praying for the ability to fly, unaware that the voices he trusted were not urging him to ascend, but commanding him to jump. The most profane secret of their entire spiritual journey was about to be revealed. On the 3rd of May, 1587, inside the stone walls of Shebon Castle, the final act of the divine drama commenced. The atmosphere in the scrying chamber was no longer one of enlightened discovery, but of suffocating, anxious dread. John Dee, aged and weary, knelt in prayer, but his words were a desperate plea for clarity in a world that had become hopelessly opaque. Edward Kelly, sullen and withdrawn, took his position before the stone, the picture of a reluctant martyr being dragged to his post one last time. The entity that manifested in the vision was not a majestic archangel, but the spirit Madimi, who often appeared as an innocent child. This seemingly pure vessel would be the mouthpiece for the most corrupting and perverse command they had ever received. Through Kelly, the childlike voice of Madimi delivered the message. It spoke of unity, of the four of them, Dee, Kelly, and their wives, Jane and Joan, becoming one. It declared that for their sacred work to be completed, all things must be held in common, not just their knowledge, not just their property, but everything. The voice then articulated the unthinkable, a command that shattered the sanctified air of the room. It ordered them to practice cross-matching. John Dee and Edward Kelly were to swap their wives. The words, so alien and obscene, hung in the silence, a poison that instantly contaminated the 7 years of work, faith, and sacrifice that had led to this single horrifying moment. For the first time since their partnership began, John Dee's faith broke. The scholar, the logician, the devout Christian within him roared to the surface in absolute protest. His diary records his visceral horror as he argued passionately with the entity, his voice trembling with disbelief and rage. He cited scripture, divine law, and simple human morality, declaring the act a detestable and heinous sin. How could a messenger from God command an act of adultery, a defilement that would surely lead to their damnation? This was the rationalist Dee, the Queen's philosopher, making his last stand, desperately trying to find the line between divine mystery and demonic blasphemy. He was no longer a passive scribe, he was a man fighting for his soul. The response from the stone was swift and merciless. The entity, through Kelly, did not debate or reason, it rebuked. It chastised Dee for his fleshly wisdom and his inability to grasp the nature of true spiritual obedience. This act, it argued, was not a sin, but the ultimate sacrifice of earthly attachment, a test so profound it would burn away their mortal limitations. For those who are truly pure, the angel claimed, all actions are themselves pure. Kelly, meanwhile, performed his role to perfection. He expressed his own shock and revulsion, making the message seem all the more authentic. He was a fellow victim of this incomprehensible divine will, solidifying the pressure on Dee until it became unbearable. The days that followed were an agony of indecision for John Dee. His mind became a relentless battlefield where faith and reason waged a war of annihilation. To refuse the command meant accepting that the past 7 years, the loss of his position, his fortune, his home, had been for nothing. It meant conceding that he had been the fool of a manipulative charlatan, or worse, the plaything of demons. The entire foundation of his reality would crumble into dust. Yet, to obey meant committing a mortal sin, violating his sacred marriage vows, and betraying the wife who had endured so much for his sake. The entities had engineered the perfect psychological trap, a dilemma where either choice led to absolute ruin. In the end, his obsession was stronger than his morality. The need for his life's work to be true, for his sacrifices to have meant something, outweighed the shrieking protest of his own conscience. In a final, tragic act of submission, he surrendered his will to the voices. The most heartbreaking moment is recorded in his own hand, the scene where he informed his wife, Jane. She fell to the floor, weeping and crying out to God, her spirit utterly broken by this ultimate betrayal from the husband she had followed into exile. The new covenant was sealed not with angelic fire, but with the tears of a devastated woman, a profane pact made in a desolate castle far from home. This was the true price of his forbidden knowledge. The secret concealed within this shocking command was not a pathway to divine power. It was the mechanism of his and Kelly's final destruction. If Kelly was a fraud, this was his endgame, an act so depraved it would either give him total, irreversible control over Dee or shatter their partnership for good, freeing him from the arrangement. If the entities were real, it was their masterpiece of cruelty, a way to utterly defile the humanity of their subjects, proving that their ultimate goal was not enlightenment, but corruption. The act was carried out, and as prophesied, it irrevocably broke the bond between the two men. The grand quest for God's wisdom had led John Dee to a sordid act of human violation, forever tainting his legacy. The profane act that was meant to bind them together in a holy covenant shattered them completely. The partnership between John Dee and Edward Kelly, strained for years by suspicion and resentment, dissolved in the toxic fallout of their shared transgression. Kelly, taking his alchemical secrets with him, soon departed, eventually meeting a grim end in a Bohemian prison. Dee, now abandoned and spiritually bankrupt, began the long journey back to England in 1589. He returned not as a triumphant prophet, but as a ghost. The home he came back to was a desecrated tomb. His magnificent library, the intellectual heart of England, and his life's greatest passion, had been pillaged by rivals and fearful locals who saw his books as instruments of sorcery. The priceless knowledge he had spent a lifetime gathering was lost to flame and theft, a devastatingly literal symbol of his own ruin. The England he returned to was also not the one he had left. His steadfast patron, Queen Elizabeth I, was in the twilight of her reign. Upon her death in 1603, the throne passed to King James I, a man whose intellectual obsessions ran not to celestial mechanics, but to demonology and the hunting of witches. In the paranoid, puritanical atmosphere of the Jacobean court, a figure like John Dee, trailing rumors of scrying and angelic pacts, was not an asset, but a liability. He was a discomforting relic of a more ambiguous age. The man who had charted the course for the British Empire was now an outcast within it, his petitions to the new king to have his name cleared of witchcraft falling on deaf ears. The final years of the great Dr. Dee were a slow, painful descent into irrelevance. The scholar who once advised monarchs and corresponded with the leading minds of Europe was forced to sell off his remaining books and possessions simply to eat. He died in poverty and near total obscurity sometime around the year 1608, a lonely and broken man buried in an unmarked grave. History, written by the victors and the fearful, moved quickly to erase him. His monumental contributions to science and his pivotal role in the Elizabethan state were minimized, overshadowed by the more sensational and more easily dismissible tale of his descent into occultism. It was safer to remember the architect of an empire as a deluded old fool, and so we are left staring into the same black mirror that captivated him, asking the same question that has been whispering through history for 4 centuries. What was the secret that John Dee took to his grave? Was he merely the victim of an elaborate, cruel deception by Edward Kelly, a charlatan of unparalleled genius who played upon one great man's fatal flaw? Or did Dee, in his relentless pursuit of knowledge, actually succeed? Did he open a door to another dimension, only to find that the beings on the other side were not angels, but intelligent, amoral entities who saw his ambition as a vulnerability to be exploited, a mind to be broken for their own inscrutable purposes? For 400 years, the world has chosen the simpler story, but the meticulous, sprawling diaries of John Dee remain, a haunting testament to a far stranger and more complex truth. They suggest that the frontier between genius and madness, between faith and delusion, is as thin and reflective as the surface of a scrying glass. Dee's ultimate legacy is not an answer, but a terrible and eternal question. His story is a warning that the insatiable human quest for absolute knowledge is a double-edged sword, and perhaps the greatest wisdom lies not in finding all the answers, but in learning to recognize which questions are far too dangerous to ever ask.